Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre. Ramachandra Guha has been an astute and lucid guide to Indian history with an ability to paint both the broad canvas as well as fill in the minute details. Most people know him as a columnist, sometimes controversial, but always insightful and engaging. But there is another side to him, that of the scrupulous historian and scholarly pathbreaker. In the field of environmental history, the social history of Indian cricket, the history of the Indian Republic, and in biographies of lesser known figures like Verrier Elwin and very public figures like M.K. Gandhi. This episode of BIC Talks is a series of extracts from a Festschrift in honor of Ramachandra Guha, originally presented as a BIC Streams session on the 25th of June 2021, which was incidentally the birth anniversary of George Orwell. This little tidbit will make more sense later in the episode. A Functioning Anarchy, edited by Nandini, Sundar and Srinath Raghavan, is a collection of essays by historians, social scientists, ecologists and journalists in appreciation of the scholar in Guha. Srinath Raghavan, professor, author and one of the editors of the collection, makes his opening remarks.
Thank you, Lekha, and a very good evening to every one of you. I'd also like to thank our host, Bangalore International Centre, for curating this event and bringing us all together on this wonderful virtual platform. And would also like to record my gratitude to the publisher of the volume that we are discussing today, which is Penguin Random House India. Nehru, Gokhale, and her team have done a fantastic job in bringing this book to fruition. Let me begin by just talking a little bit about the background to this particular project. As Lekha said, Ram Guha needs no introduction to any of you. In fact, if all of you are here, it is primarily because you already know him. If you check out Ram's Twitter profile, you will find that he has some 2 million followers, right? I mean, that's the size of followers that typically pop stars and other sort of celebrity industry people like to tally up. But Ram Guha has managed to do that by his extraordinary sort of contributions in a very public way, in helping us understand how the history of India's emergence as a republic and a democracy has really shaped our present. So in a sense, if there is a historian today who has made the past speak to the present in a very direct and tangible way, intervening in a range of debates as they pertain to our own times, but drawing all the time on the history that has shaped us, it is very much Ram Guha. And in doing this volume, which is styled as a Festschrift, right? The Festschrift is typically a contribution that former students and colleagues of distinguished scholars tend to make at the very end of a scholar's sort of professional career. Now, we actually had a different starting point. We decided to do this volume because we thought that there was no end to Ram's scholarly career. In the time that we held the conference and the volume was produced, he has already written 2 other books. In fact, at the very last minute, we had to amend the proofs to include a new memoir that he has written about cricket just a couple of months ago. Right? So the challenge was really to keep up with Ram's scholarly productivity and make our voice felt before he rose to oblivion. Yeah. So in a very real sense, this is not a Festschrift as a culmination of someone's scholarly career, but just choosing a moment to celebrate an extraordinary life in scholarship and methods. So about 3 years ago, when Ram turned 60, a group of us really came together without any sort of, directing force. But Nandini Sundar, who's the other editor, who's unfortunately not able to join us today, was really the guiding, maestro behind the entire exercise. And Nandini brought this group of us together for a 3-day sort of workshop and conference, talking about various aspects of Ram's life. And the book that we have chosen to do here came out of those sets of conversations, which in turn are actually reflections of conversations that all of us have been having with Ram and his work over several decades. I mean, just to speak for myself, and I'm sure my other colleagues will speak for themselves. I mean, I first got to know Ram when I was merely a graduate student and Ram was already an extremely established historian. And I just sent him an email out of the blue saying that, I came across something in the archives and whether he knew something about it. And the generosity and care with which he replied has led to a lifelong sort of engagement with each other's work and friendship, for which I'm extremely grateful, as are each of the colleagues who have contributed to this volume. So in a very real sense, Ram Guha, because he has chosen to work outside the portals of formal academia for much of his career, has not had that many students. None of us are in a real sense his students. But I think all of us have learned so much from his work that we can count ourselves as students of Ram's work. And as students who, I suppose Ram will reflect, have in some ways taken on board his ideas, modified, suitably rejected them at points, but used them as ways of thinking and moving our own thought and research. So the volume really is an attempt to uncover and remind ourselves of this extraordinary hinterland of scholarship that Ram has sort of contributed to over the decades, which is merely the background to all his public writing and his other activity, which is what has, in some ways, created so much of extraordinary interest. But at the same time, it is not as if there is a hiatus between Ram's scholarship on the one side and his public writing on the other side. In fact, if there is anything that I think Ram has to be centrally sort of credited for, it is to bring serious history to a very large reading public. In a very real sense, the historian as a paperback writer is a very rare bird in the Indian context. And Ramachandra Guha, who has some ornithological interest to begin with, would recognize himself as one of those. He has flown over a very vast landscape. That landscape has covered environmental history. It has covered the social history of sport. It has covered biography, of which he has been an extraordinary proselytizer, as well as a practitioner in our own times. And it has covered the terrain of contemporary history, which before Ram came along, few serious historians wanted to touch as a proper historical subject. So in many instances, from environmental history through biography to contemporary history, Ram has not just been a pioneer, but in effect created a field which many of us then have been privileged to come into, work, and to take his own sort of ideas forward. So in a very real sense, this is a tribute to Ramachandra Guha, the scholar who has always believed that the pursuit of scholarship was not only for conversation with other scholars, but to be taken to a much wider reading audience, which is what makes Ram such a unique figure, not just in Indian life and letters, but I would say that in the world of ideas more broadly. So I'm very delighted, therefore, to have this opportunity to take this conversation forward with Ram today. We have four of our colleagues who have written about these various aspects of Ram's work in the volume, but we thought it would be a great idea to just hear them talk about Ram's contributions to their particular areas of interest and how it has molded that field.
Next, we have sociologist Amitabh Babiskar.
May I say what a pleasure it is to be here. This occasion has been a long time coming, and I'm so happy that this volume in honor of Ram is out. Thank you, Srinath and Nandini, for putting it together. And I hope, Ram, you like it, and I hope lots of other readers out there like it too. So I first met Ram in 1987 at the Delhi School of Economics. At that time, I was finishing an MA there, and he was visiting from Calcutta, where he was finishing a PhD. And I was told by a teacher of mine that he would be the best person to talk to about doing a PhD in environmental sociology, a subject that was unknown and untaught in India at that time, but a subject that seemed to speak to my keen but pretty confused desire to study nature and culture. And I remember that Ram was not only very knowledgeable, but he was also very kind. I remember that he urged me to read Verrier Elwin. And after we finished talking on the lawns of the Delhi School of Economics, I went right away to the Ratan Tata Library and I issued out their copy of the Bega right away. So soon after that, I began to read Ram's work, first in the pages of the Economic and Political Weekly, and then his book, Unquiet Woods, and which, as most of you know, is a social history of the origins and the present of the Chipko movement and peasant resistance against forestry policies in the lower Himalaya. And it was through reading these works that I got a sort of an intellectual crush on Ram. In the presence of his awe-inspiring figure, I would become totally tongue-tied and awkward. I'd be racking my brains to say something halfway intelligent. And my hero worship knew no bounds. I even read his cricket books. Despite being 100% sports deaf, I would pore over them earnestly, reading all about the career of Bishan Singh Bedi, puzzling over Yorkers and Googlies and silly midons. Because it didn't matter if I didn't care about cricket one whit, if Ram Guha had written it, it had to be read. But so Now that I'm more grown up, that sense of awe has ebbed a bit, but my admiration for Ram as the first and foremost chronicler and critic of environmental politics, which is my own subject, has only grown. This is a book that, as a whole, celebrates Ram's contribution to scholarship and to informed public debate. A book that begins, this is Srinath and Nandini's introduction, they begin by noting his role as a preeminent argumentative Indian in the best sense of Amartya Sen's term. So it's no surprise that the essays in the environmental section respectfully disagree with each other and provide different views on related subjects. Shashank Kela's essay on why foresters no longer do any worthwhile research, a decline that he traces to the institutional culture of the forest bureaucracy, is in some ways at odds with Karthik and Meera's essay, where they argue that knowledge production about conservation should be decentralized. The subject is much too important to be safe in the hands of specialists, especially scientists and foresters. My own rather bleak essay on how conflicts over rivers are increasingly being steered through courts of law and regulatory bodies rather than through social movements on the ground. Um, an essay where I argue that a techno-managerial discourse of ecological health has displaced older assertions based on human rights, citizenship, and cultural identity. This essay of mine is in some ways at odds with Brothati and Joanne's more optimistic assertion about the continuing power of environmental campaigns to fight and to win. Ram's clear-eyed vision about ecology and equity, which captivated me all those years ago, is still compelling today when environmental crises have become crippling. That is why, even as we fan out into new areas of research, human animal relations, multi species ethnographies, climate change, agrarian ecology, pollution, or health, Ram's body of work still serves as a compass to steer by, reminding us what the important issues are, where lie North and South, or should I say the global North and the global South. So, for your pioneering work, your approach, and your insights, which have inspired so many of us, and for your many kindnesses and generosity, thank you so much, Ram.
Next, we have author A.R. Venkatachalapati.
It's a really big pleasure and honor to be part of this event, because Ram is not just a dear friend, but to all of us is a peer, an inspirational scholar who has been a kind of beacon light to many of us. I'm going to be saying a few words about how he has put biography squarely on the intellectual map of India. I just want to start with two little things. Many of you would be familiar with the biography of Ramanujan, Srinivasa Ramanujan, the mathematician, written by Robert Canigan. If you read its preface, you notice that the agent of Canigan comes to him and says, "Can you write a biography of Ramanujan?" This man says, Ramanujan, who? He has no clue to who Ramanujan is. But the book has been written, and if you see the preface, he has taken exactly 3 years to write this biography. The call comes in 1987. He doesn't know who Ramanujan is, and in 3 years, he has this biography. Now, 30 years later, this man has done another achievement to his credit. There was a great Homeric scholar called Milman Parry at Harvard. He lived for only 33 years and published exactly 2 long essays in his lifetime. And this Robert Canigan has now come up with a biography of this man. So for somebody like, what drew me to Ram Guha was his great biographical writing. As a young scholar in Delhi, studying in JNU, or earlier in Chennai, reading the newspapers and reading subaltern studies, we first got to know of Ram Guha as the author of Social Forestry in Coma. That was an essay that actually opened my eyes. Subsequently, his long essays in the Hindu of his meeting with E.P. Thompson. And of course, finally, his great essay, which Srinath, you and Nandini call Ram Guha, the romantic biographer. Verrier Elwin. Such a path-breaking book. What Ram Guha has done is to make scholars not be any more defensive about taking up the task of writing biographies. Ultimately, the great impersonal forces of history are manifest only through individuals and persons. And over the last 20, 30 years, apart, of course, from his big books, the Gandhi biographies, the Verrier Elwin biography, this number of short essays, whether it is about the story of Balu in his history of cricket, corner of a foreign field, was, such a eye-opener to all of us, inspirational, deeply inspirational. So Ram Guha has been inspirational not only through his writings, but also as a person. As all of us have had this experience, when we were introduced to Ram Guha, immediately you would respond by saying, I already know you. I've read this piece or that piece. What it does to a young scholar is unimaginable. The kind of confidence it gives to a young scholar. I have many personal debts to repay to Ram, but I just want to acknowledge one very important debt. I continue to be primarily a Tamil writer, but for Ram, I would not have got into writing so much in English. So there are many other debts, but the art of biography, the craft of biography, and the science of biography, all of these come together in Ram Guha's work. And what we have done, the 5 of us have contributed essays under the rubric of the makers of Indian democracy. 5 essays. I assure you that at least 4 of them are outstanding essays. I should add that Ram Guha's turns of phrases have always been inspirational, a model for us to emulate. And I'm sure titles like this, we have thought of it primarily because of Ram Guha. I still remember this one beautiful line in a corner of a foreign field. The entire team goes to Pune, where there is strict prohibition for whatever reason. He writes, the team stoutly put up with the absence of alcohol. The fun was so apt. Your face lights up, and if somebody is around in the room when you are reading Ram Guha, they would think that you are completely mad, laughing at yourself. Ram Guha, as we all know, has been very ecumenical. Even though these days we use the double-barreled hyphenated term left liberal, these are like polar opposites. When we grew up, you can't put a leftist and a liberal in the same room. Or in fact, you couldn't put 2 leftists in the same room. Because as Ram Guha once wrote about the various schisms in the Indian ultra-left movement, he said they splintered so much, and the most fratricidal group goes by the name of party unity. So Ram Guha has alerted us to the contribution of right-wing intellectuals or non-left-wing intellectuals.
Jahnavi Phalke, historian of science, speaks about her experience with Ramachandra Guha.
I first met Ram in 2008, early 2008. I had just defended my PhD thesis and I was traveling to Bangalore because I'd started working on the history of aeronautics, which I still continue to work on. I met Ram, and I had just written to him randomly as a graduate student who has just defended a thesis, saying, you know what, I actually work on contemporary history, and here is what I have done. He met with me, and with great enthusiasm and engagement, asked me lots of questions about my thesis, was totally interested, which was very surprising because like like my co-contributors in this section, but like and very much like most people who are engaged with writing contemporary history of India, our community is very small. It's growing, and thanks, of course, to efforts that Ram and his colleagues have put in the New India Foundation, which includes Srinath. That tribe is now growing, which is wonderful, and it's a space that has been created, largely thanks to Ram and a few others. So, so that was my moment of getting to know Ram out of nowhere, and he engaged with me, he encouraged me, and that has not stopped. And so I'm grateful to him. So it's a pleasure and a privilege today to speak at this wonderful event. Thank you, Srinath and Nandini, for organizing this, for bringing this together, for the wonderful birthday party, of course, which we also had when we all met to discuss our papers. So let me say a few words about the space, the energetic, argumentative, enthusiastic space that Ram has opened up for the kind of work that my co-contributors and I do. A critical citizen, a citizen historian, words that Ram has used about his work himself. And he talks with great romance and love of the object of his study. There are terms of endearment that come through in his work, and I'll use centrally India after Gandhi, because that's the work that I've used in my teaching, but also in my thinking. Unnatural nation, unlikely democracy, 50-50 or 50-50 democracy, sui generic nation, exasperating, at all times most interesting, and India creating magic with democracy. I think the love comes through, the love shines through of the work that he does and why he does it and what drives him. And this is inspirational when a younger scholar comes to an area of study which has largely been ignored by the tribe of historians, for whom history, as Ram very rightly has noted several times, stops in 1947. The cutoff date is so, and to then arrive to a domain which with so much love by Ram is inspiring, to say the least, and enthusing and energizing, to say a little bit more. When one reads through Ram's work on contemporary history of India, his work is pioneering in opening up that landscape massively. Together with the one book that came earlier, which is Sunil Khilnani's The Idea of India. What Ram has done is, the way I look at it, it's like a photography enthusiast, right? Like a professional photographer, changing lenses all the time in order to capture more, less, wider pan views of what contemporary India and what contemporary Indian democracy is like. You see the lenses he uses: hardware of democracy, software of democracy, fault lines of Indian democracy in caste, religion, class, and language, gender, cutting through all four of them, laboratory of social conflict, ideas, approaches, sources that are also different, that he brings all together to bear. So, even a historian of science like myself isn't lost, because you see in his work, he has used Haldane. He has used Haldane to tell stories that historians of science don't tell. When you see, like I said, the lenses, his approach. Here is Ram's scholarship, where he has looked at, and he continues to look at, democratic institutions established and eroded in the years since India became a democracy, ideas that have been contested and transformed, and the idea central to his work, the third global adventure of an idea of democracy that started out with the American and French revolutions, and the third being the most important, simply because of the kind of vibrancy that Indian democracy adds to that debate. And finally, individuals. Biography, which Chalapati has already spoken about, putting individuals at the center, giving individuals the importance in history writing that has sadly been neglected for way too many decades. The engagement that Ram has with us, in a way, for me, the most, the conversations often written at the end of a particular journey. And of course, Srinath noted right at the start, Ram will probably have written another essay by the time we talk to him next, is people are important to Ram. And it's a privilege to be to have his time and attention. More recently, many of you might have seen the essays that he wrote about Shekhar Pathak and Gopal Gandhi. The tenderness with which Ram is able to write about people in his lives those essays are not only a testimony to a history of friendships, but also contemporary history in a sense of the intellectual landscape of India in its making. I struggled for a bit, not for too long, because I decided then eventually not to write that email, because when I read those two essays that Ram has written, they were incredibly touching. They were incredibly touching as touching and emotional. And it tells us that Ram, in a way, pours himself into what he does, into the people that he knows and the people and into things that he cares about. Breathless, energetic, enthusiastic, those are the kind of words that come to one's mind when one reads Ram's work. And that gives us, younger scholars trying to write contemporary history of India, the confidence and the space that we are now able to occupy thanks to his work. The argumentative, of course, I haven't forgotten. Ram is a keen observer of contemporary. He has the skill of noticing the recent past and the present historically. What he does, and I think quite incredibly, is that he renders the present not archival, but historical. And I think that's a skill that I aspire to learn every time I read anything that he has written. It's therefore with affection and gratefulness that I am incredibly happy to have been able to contribute to this and to be able to speak today and share some of my thoughts on what Ram has meant to me, and hopefully also to my co-contributors in this journey.
Sports editor and author Suresh Menon talks about the cricket historian in Ramachandra Guha.
It'll be very difficult to convince me that our session today on this date is pure coincidence, because Ram knows as well as I do that it's a very significant date in the history of Indian cricket. This was the date, June 25th, when India played their first ever cricket test match at Lord's in England in 1932. It was also the date when India won their first ever World Cup in England again, at Lord's again, in 1983. So I don't believe that it's a coincidence that we are speaking today, because I often tell Ram that it's so good to have a cricket writer who also writes history and all these other things that we've been talking about. I have known Ram for a little over 30 years now. And I've been thinking about this a bit now, and I feel that maybe had I met him a little earlier, maybe had I met him when I was younger, my life might have changed. I might have become a different kind of a person, because there's something about Ram that influences people, and it doesn't matter in what field. It doesn't matter. There's an energy that gets across to you. I'll give you an example, which I've quoted before. When my son had finished his graduation and was looking for, a field to sort of immerse himself in, his professor said, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to be the classical stuff, an engineer, a doctor, an architect, a media personnel, or do you want to be Ramachandra Guha? And this was the first that I heard of Ram as a career option, but it was a nice way of saying that it's a generic term for excellence across a number of fields. And I think it's important to see how Ram has brought there is a unity, there's a harmony in Ram's writings, and cricket is not something that is in the fringes of it. I think cricket is at the center of it. In fact, he once said, I write on history to make a living and on cricket to live, which tells us all we know. In his recent book, Commonwealth of Cricket, he says very beautifully, we who write on cricket do so without envy. You must forgive me because I'm going to be quoting a lot from Ram's various works, which really give you a sense of Ram the writer. And I shall also be reading from his from the book. And one of my favorite paras in this book, it's by David Gilmour, the British historian. And he starts by saying, my first impression of Ram Guha was that he was like an intellectual of about 60 or 70 years ago, with his rough tweed jacket and baggy trousers, his tousled hair, his round-lensed spectacles, and his rather shambling gait. He looked like a figure of the 1930s. Underneath his jacket, he wore a patterned jersey that might have been knitted for George Orwell. Furthermore, he talked in the way that Bhadralok scholars used to talk, rapidly and excitedly on a wide variety of subjects. I think that's a para that has captured this personality beautifully. And I particularly like the reference to George Orwell because I have made the same reference myself. So it's nice to know that a British historian feels the same way. Anyway, back to cricket. Ram writes in Spin and Other Turns, he says, I have gloried unashamedly in the achievement of others in cricket. He says, to fail at art or politics is to embitter one for life. To fail on the cricket field is to marvel at those who don't. And there is a certain, many years ago, an English leg spinner named Ian Peebles said that there is no cricket fan like those who watch with 12-year-old eyes. And I think Ram, of course, he's now past 60, and he still watches cricket with 12-year-old eyes. And I suspect that this is what gives his writing a special flavor, because you have to love what you do. And it's very easy to be, I have been writing cricket for nearly 4 decades now. And I occasionally see that my writing tends to get a bit cynical because I've seen it all, I've heard it all. And then you tend to get a bit cynical. And then I to sort of detoxify myself, I read something that Ram has written, and I'm back to where I should be. And I think I may owe a little more to Ram than I've really admitted all these years, or even sensed in my mind. But I think it's important, this aspect of being excited, this aspect of being of bringing together a whole range of subjects which have this this element, almost a childlike element. It's a wonderful balance between a professor and a childlike person existing in the same mind. And this is something that I've always thought was very special about Ram, who also said that to write on cricket, one must also know how to fail, and fail disastrously, which is why your Don Bradmans and your Sachin Tendulkars are not great cricket writers, because they don't really understand failure. To write on sport, you have to understand failure. And it's always the bright young cricketer who didn't quite make it, who's a very good cricket writer. It's a bright young athlete who didn't quite make it, who understands, who empathizes with the failure of athletes. And I think this is something that comes through very, very strongly. Ram also said, had I been much better, I would not have had the necessary empathy. Had I been much worse, I would not have had the necessary understanding. And I think that says beautifully what I've been trying to say, because empathy and understanding run like a golden thread through all of Ram's writings. And you can an earlier speaker said about how she read Ram's cricket just because it was Ram writing it, and because she would. It's not necessary to. It's like watching a painting. It's not necessary to understand the painting. It's just important to appreciate it. And I think that is an extremely good point that the lady made, where she said that you have to, the idea of appreciation does not presuppose understanding or total understanding. And I think that's Ram has brought in more, I think, let me put it this way, Ram has brought in more fans into the game, has brought in more serious cricket fans who have now, over all these years, developed a love for the game than something like the IPL has. And I think that's something that he ought to be proud of, because his views on the IPL are rather well known. When Ram wrote A Corner of a Foreign Field, or till Ram wrote A Corner of a Foreign Field, Indian cricket writing had been stuck in two or three sort of slots. One was, of course, the statistical, purely statistical, so many runs, so many wickets, so many this, so many that, boring stuff. The other was so-called biography, which was basically hagiography, where so-and-so is the greatest, he could do no wrong. The only reason he didn't succeed was because the officials didn't pick him, and the only reason the officials didn't pick him was because they had one of them had a son who was doing the same, the usual sort of madness that cricket fans talk about. So what Ram did with The Corner of a Foreign Field was bring in this new element of a historical, interpretative language in cricket writing, which hadn't existed in India before. And this is a quote I like from there, where Lord Harris was an Englishman who has been given a lot of credit for developing Indian cricket. He was in many ways seen as the father of Indian cricket and so on. And Ram writes quite with a straight face. He says, Lord Harris's contributions to the development of Indian cricket have been vastly exaggerated. Had he played more cricket with or against Indians, he might have been less disliked. So in a couple of sentences, he's not only told you about the relationship between the master and the ruled, he's also told you why certain things, why the master was intensely disliked for the kind of person he was, which no history book, no other regular history book will give you. In the classic book on cricket, which is Beyond a Boundary by C.L.R. James, he asks the most famous question in cricket literature: what do they know of cricket who only cricket know? Ram asks, what do they know of history who only history know? I'd now like to read a small bit from the introduction that you and Nandini have done, which says something important, something interesting. Here we are. You write here, Guha admits that he was directionless, missing class in college, playing bridge and cricket, till he met his wife, the talented designer Sujata Keshavan, in 1979, when she was studying at the National Institute of Design. And you go on to say, and I think this is very crucial and needs to be better known. He says, you say, illness, injury, or a death in the family, none of these seem to keep Guha from writing any more than a singer can stop singing or an artist painting. This single-minded pursuit of scholarship has been made possible by Sujata Keshavan, whose calm management of the family and its finances has ensured for him the time and space to write. And I once suggested this to a friend. I said, if at some point, obviously, and possibly one of us sitting here will write a biography of Ram. And I think the first volume can be Ram before Sujata, and the second can be Ram after Sujata.
Now, Ramachandra Guha responds.
Thank you all. First of all, just deep gratitude and affection for Srinath and Nandini for putting together this wonderful volume. I'm particularly grateful that they've disregarded my tweets altogether and given my columns the short shrift sometimes, maybe not always, but sometimes deserve, and taken my books rather more seriously. Now, I'll come to what I've learned from the book. towards the end of what I have to say. I mean, each essay is a little jewel. I read them one a day, every evening, soaking in what they had to say and learning many new things about my country, about modes of analysis, about environment, about history, about politics, about sport, about society. And it's just a hugely enjoyable experience reading each one of those essays individually. The BIC has titled this session Intellectual Journeys Through Modern India. So I want to say a little bit about the kind of particular conjuncture in which I became a scholar, which I think was very, it's a conjuncture that influenced not just me, but many other scholars who have contributed to history and social science in independent India. It was a conjuncture that saw three kinds of institutions flourishing without which scholarship cannot happen. The first institution is the scholarly journal. Now, in your introduction, Srinath and Nandini, you mentioned my affection for the EPW. And Amitabh also mentioned that in what she had to say. But there were two other journals, more scholarly, less political, arguably more rigorous, that were really flourishing in the 1980s when I began my own scholarly journey. One was Dharma Kumar's Indian Economic and Social History Review, and the other was T.N. Madan's contributions to Indian sociology. Now, here are two world-class journals out of India in the two disciplines that mean most to me. I mean, I can't speak about economics or philosophy or political science, but T.N. Madan's contributions and Dharma Kumar's ISHR were carrying the best work on the sociology and history of India, written by Indians or foreigners from absolutely across the world, across generations, and across ideologies. One of the extraordinary things about Dharma Kumar and Madan was their ecumenical attitude to genre, to ideology, to type of research. All they wanted was high quality original research. And often it was unknown people who wrote. There was no network. It wasn't chamchas or disciples who were writing for them. So I think journals are one aspect of a scholarly community. And I think contributions on ISHR, along of course with EPW, enabled that in the 1980s and 90s when I was beginning my scholarly journey. And I was deeply fortunate in learning from these journals, occasionally writing from them, debating their contents with sociologists and historians, usually in the Delhi School of Economics coffee house in those decades. The second kind of institution, which is crucial for scholarship, particularly historical scholarship, is the archive. And although, as both Janvi and Srinath mentioned, and Chalapati knows all too well, the National Archive was never particularly well run, and God knows what will happen after Central Vista. It may disappear altogether. We had, coming up in the 70s and 80s, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Again, a world-class archive established and run out of India. Two visionary directors, B.R. Nanda and Ravinder Kumar, reasonably well known. Much less known are the outstanding deputy directors who nurtured the institution and built actually the manuscript collection and the oral history collection. People like Haridev Sharma, D.N. Paragehi, V.C. Joshi, Deepa Bhatnagar, and Balakrishnan. And without the NMML, I could not have written a single one of my works, and that's probably true of most of the contributors to this book. And it's again, if I'd been born 20 years earlier, I would not have had the NMML. 20 years later, I'd have seen the NMML decline under UPA, and of course, after that, even more decline even more precipitously under the NDA. So that's the second institution that is crucial to scholarship, historical scholarship, a well-run professional archive, continuously gathering new material and making them accessible to scholars in a way in which it can be used profitably for research and writing. So journals, an archive, and finally, quality scholarly publishing. In the 50s and 60s, there was a pioneering publishing house in India called Asia Publishing House, run actually by a Sri Lankan called Jai Singh, which published the first important works of historians like Irfan Habib and sociologists like M.N. Srinivas. But then they disappeared. And there was a vacuum. And in the 1980s, you had the flourishing of scholarly publishing, arguably led by the Oxford University Press, but alongside it, other publishers like Sage and Orient Longman, and specialist publishers in, for example, feminism, Kali for Women in Women's Studies, or the Center for Science and Environment in my own field, environmental history and sociology. So you again had really first-rate works of scholarship coming out in book form, edited by Indians, proofread by Indians, designed by Indians, marketed by Indians, reviewed by Indians. I mean, again, back in the 80s and 90s, every major newspaper had a serious book review section in which works of history, sociology, politics, and philosophy were reviewed seriously, as Suresh will remember very well from his days in the Indian Express. So I think that conjuncture was very, very important in shaping what I could do and in the debates I could participate in, along with dozens of other Indians of different social and ethnic and backgrounds. Now, however, as I reflect on that ecosystem of journals, archives, and publishers, some of it still remains. I mean, it's not all of it has gone. Quite a lot of it still remains. I think it had one major deficiency. And that deficiency was it operated exclusively in English. Now, I think English is essential. I'm not one of those who at all apologizes for writing in English, because English is essential to communicate between different states in India and, of course, communicate to a global community. But what was happening in the 80s and 90s was the decline of the bilingual intellectual world that had previously been so important in India. Earlier generations of sociologists like Iravati Karve wrote in Marathi and in English. Earlier generations of historians like, shall we say, Dadunath Sarkar or Didi Kosambi wrote in their mother tongue and in English. Now, these two discourses were being separated. Now, I was one of those fortunate enough to learn from those writing in Indian languages. Shekhar Pathak has been mentioned, and without his work in Hindi, I could never have become a historian of Uttarakhand, or the work of Chalapati in Tamil Nadu, or Supriya Chaudhary and others in Bengal, or Jatin Naik in Orissa. But I think that was one probable area in which I think now maybe a more healthy discourse across linguistic domains is coming up. So I think I have written extensively about individuals to whom I owe debts, most recently about Shekhar Pathak and Gopal Gandhi, but about people like Anjan Ghosh, my sociological mentor in Kolkata, Krishna Raj, founder of the EPW, D.R. Nagaraj, the great historian and sociologist of Kannada literary culture. But I think institutions matter a great deal. And I think in the intellectual journeys that India undertakes in the Modi years and beyond, I think journals, publishing houses, and archives will have to play a central role if we can deepen and further the intellectual culture we have. And I think that's not just my experience, but the experience of every one of the contributors to this book. Now, I just end by saying how much I've enjoyed the book and the different essays, and what lessons I'm taking away from it. I began my career as a historian of the environment and as a biographer of relatively minor figures. And then I moved to becoming a political historian of Indian democracy and a biographer of really major figures. Gandhi, of course, but it's people like Nehru, Ambedkar, and Patel who are at the heart, and Indira Gandhi who are at the heart of India after Gandhi. And I think this book has encouraged, provoked, inspired me to return to my origins. So I am now hoping to go back to environmental history and start a project that had begun but then later abandoned on the intellectual origins of Indian environmentalism. And in the way I approach that project, I'll be certainly provoked and inspired and challenged by all the wonderful essays in A Functioning Anarchy. And though Gandhi can never leave me, I think Gandhi is inside me till I die, I cannot write a biography of a major figure again. I've been asked to write a biography of Jawaharlal Nehru. I said no, because I think I've said what I had to say about him in India after Gandhi. I've several friends whom I admire greatly have asked me to write on Ambedkar, which also, for various other reasons, I don't think I am competent to do. As I wrote in a recent column, I was even approached to write a biography of the most rapidly, the fastest billionaire in Indian history, Gautam Advani, and it took no thought at all to reject that out of hand. Ambedkar I was attracted by. I mean, Ambedkar and Nehru, I might think seriously about. But I think the essays in this book have convinced me that if I have to follow my biographical instincts, it will be about lesser known people who led interesting, obscure, admirable lives, and through whose stories you can illuminate corners of Indian history previously unknown or underexplored. So thank you very much for this wonderful session, for the book that Srinath and Nandini have put together. I hope Nandini in Bastar has access on her phone to this recording, and for all your friendship and affection. Thank you.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.